Jesus Christ is the Lord of lords and kings of all kings. He lives forever. And he who has Jesus lives with him forever. Hold on to the Lord. I'm saying this to encourage you. In the name of my Jesus and your Jesus, be of courage, good cheer. Don't ever fear nothing. Don't ever fear no one. Live strong in the Lord. Live mighty in the Lord. Give all glory to him. Nothing is yours. Everything is his. When you do something good, say, thank you, Lord. You are the good God who has done this through me. I am good for nothing. It is you, my Lord. You brought me here. You taught me. You made me walk in your footsteps. Thank you, Lord, for your love, for your mercy, for your blood, for your salvation and redemption. Thank you, Lord. Amen.
I'm noticing this massive wave of people kind of coming to Christ. It seems like you're seeing just all kinds of people just come out of the blue who are looking for answers. I think a lot of that is coming from what we're seeing in just society today. I think our culture is being overrun, and there's a lot of drastic changes taking place in the world that I think a lot of traditionalists don't necessarily like or agree on.
There was an interesting experiment done. It wasn't really an experiment. It was a doctor, Dr. Walter Penfield, in the 50s, I believe it was the 50s, worked on epileptic patients and would basically open their brain, and while they were lucid, would stimulate parts of the brain with electrodes trying to cure epilepsy. And he kind of mapped the brain in doing that. But what he found is he would stimulate across an area and their left arm would go up and they would say, I'm not doing that, you're doing that, which completely changed Dr. Penfield's view, because he went from believing that the brain was who we are to realizing there's a someone in there that can observe something completely separate from what's happening in the brain. But Penfield also found a spot where he put electrodes across the brain, and the person said, I'm leaving my body. And then when he stopped, would come back. Now, I don't know for sure, but I wonder if there's like a trigger in our brain where our soul can release from our body. And so at a point of near-death trauma, or maybe that is the passing of death, at least of the soul leaving the body, that something happens that is a release mechanism. And so do psychedelic drugs actually affect that, in the sense that your soul maybe is traveling or going somewhere or experiencing some things of a greater dimensionality of reality around us? I think that could be possible. So death is when I believe, when your soul leaves your body. So just so people listening know, like, my research has been into near-death experiences. And after interviewing, well over 1,000 of them, studying them, what I've come up with is an analogy of what they're experiencing. When we're talking about a cardiac arrest where there's no heartbeat, no brain waves, and yet they come back, either modern medicine resuscitates them, or I don't know, miracle, because we're talking about people who have hospital records that they were dead 1 hour and 45 minutes. A medical doctor, dead 30 minutes, pinned under a waterfall in a kayak, and yet she comes back. And what they come back commonly saying is that they were more alive than they've ever been. Well, what's that? How do you be more alive than this, right? But that's what they say. In a place more real in a place more beautiful, experiencing things that are just hard to describe. But what is fascinating, so you talked about evidence. There's evidence, lots of evidence. And I found that there are real answers. There's a ton of evidence. Like right now, it would take more faith for me not to believe than to believe because of the evidence.
Really?
Yeah.
Would you say the majority of the evidence that that brought you here is from near-death experiences?
No.
No.
I mean, those are huge. What are these near-death experiences, and how does the commonality of what they report align with what I've also found to be what I think is evidence for God's existence in history? When a person dies, when their heart stops beating, no brain waves, say they have a heart attack, and they have a near-death experience, they say they leave their body. Usually they're initially up above their body in the room where their resuscitation is happening. And they commonly say, I was still myself. Most say I had a body, but it was like a spiritual body. The story of humanity is that we've all gone our own way. We've all at some point flipped off God and said, no, my will be done. I don't care about yours. I want my will done. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's me. That's all of us. That's my everyday struggle. I don't wake up every day going, what do you want today, God? I mean, I try more and more, but it's usually like, what do I want to do? How am I going to get it done? And that's the world we live in. And so all the way back though, in Genesis 12, God claims that he raises up two people, Abraham and Sarah. And he says to them, this is Genesis 12:1, I'm going to form you into a nation, and I'm going to bless you so that all nations on earth may be blessed. So from the very beginning, even in all of our rebellion, God had a plan to bless all people, to bring us all back, everybody who wants to come back. And you see throughout the Old Testament, and this is actually what convinced me, all the way back, that was 2000 BC that he said that. So that's before any sacred writing of any world religion is put down. So this is just oral tradition at this point. Mm-hmm. Then about 1500 BC is when the sacred writings of the world, many of the world's religions start to be canonized, start to be written. And at that point, this same God of light appears to Moses on Mount Sinai, right? And calls himself the I Am. Now, fascinatingly, I interviewed a woman in Tehran who has a heart attack and sees this God who says to her, I am he who is. And then boom, she's back in her body. That's how it was translated into English, and she was speaking Farsi.
Wow.
When I heard this. Another woman, Penny, same thing. This same God of light, and he says, I am.
Wow.
And so you're pointing all the way back. Now, to Moses, God said, here's how you'll know I am truly God. I alone know what's going to happen in history. I alone can tell you in advance what's going to happen. And then it happens. And that's how you'll know. So all the way back 1500 BC says this. Well, then you have things happen in the prophets. So one of the most convincing to me, and this, by the way, is near-death experiences opened my mind. Then I started giving the Bible a chance and started reading and asking questions. And then I came across this and I was like, why didn't anybody know this? Why didn't anybody tell me this? Like, this is evidence. So Isaiah is a Jewish prophet writing in 780 BC. Okay. And he's claiming that God is revealing things to people through him. And I believe that part of what God was saying, that he wants to bless the whole world through the Jewish people. You know, you hear they're the chosen people. Well, they're not chosen like they're better than. Chosen is a responsibility. So they had a responsibility, and the responsibility was to preserve what God was revealing for all nations. And part of what he was revealing was when he would enter our world in a form we could relate to pay his own price of justice. Okay, so that's a foreshadowing. So in Isaiah chapter 9, let me back up, because sometimes what I'm about to say, people will say, well, I'm sure Jesus lived. They probably took the book of Isaiah, doctored it up after the fact, right? That would be what would be going through skeptics' minds. What would be going through my mind? In 1948, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls? We found, yeah. So in the caves of Qumran, which I've been there, fascinating story. These two shepherd boys were chasing their goats up in there, threw a rock in, hear something crash. They discover this pottery sealed with 2,000-year-old scrolls. One of them was called the Great Isaiah Scroll. It was a complete copy of the scroll, the book of Isaiah, carbon dating from 150 to 250 years before Jesus. 150 to 250 BC. Now, you can go read it online. I mean, it's in Hebrew, but you can read the translation online. So we have a copy of Isaiah, proof positive, predating Jesus. And yet, what Isaiah foretells about the coming of Jesus, the Messiah, is phenomenal. So Isaiah chapter 9 says, the region of Galilee that was in darkness will see a great light. A light will dawn. Okay, so a particular place in the whole earth, Galilee. And then 6 verses down, and it says, for to us a child is born, a son is given, the government will be on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Mighty God, Prince of Peace. And his rule and reign will never end. Okay, so this is Judaism in 700 BC. And their creed is there's only one God. And don't ever call anything or anyone else God. And so to say that there is going to be a child born, a human called Mighty God, and this began this mystery in the Jewish tradition of this Messiah that would come. Now, 700 years later, Jesus did most of his ministry in Galilee. And he did claim to be the Son of God. That's what got him crucified. Because they were expecting a conqueror to overthrow their Roman oppressors. Not what Isaiah said the Messiah would first do. So you skip forward to Isaiah chapter 53, and it says that the Messiah is going to reveal the arm of God. So imagine our two-dimensional painting again. So this isn't all there is to God. This is God's arm reaching in as a slice into our two-dimensional world. So we're only seeing a slice of the greater reality of God in the form of Jesus. He's the representation in our three-dimensional form of God. So so Isaiah 53, and again, the 780 years before Jesus, he writes this. And it says, he will be pierced for our transgressions. Okay, he was nailed to a cross. He will suffer, and by his wounds we will be healed, because all of us like sheep have wandered off. We've gone our own way, but God laid on him the sins or iniquities of us all. So this Messiah, this arm of God reaching in, is first going to suffer to pay for all of humanity's wrongs. It later goes on and says, but after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and live. resurrection. But this is in Isaiah 53, 780 years before Jesus ever came. And again, he's going to come to Galilee, a specific place. And that's just 2 of about 60 of what God put throughout these 1,500 years of writing, foretelling what he was going to do in human history.
Wow.
So here's the thing, another commonality of what near-death experiencers say is that when they leave their body, they realize that they were inhibited here. So there's more. Fascinating side note is I think the Apostle Paul probably had a near-death experience.
Why do you think that?
Well, because in Acts chapter 14, and you know, for those who don't know, the Apostle Paul, he wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, right? And by the way, he was not a believer in Jesus. He was a Pharisee. He was one of the ones who had Jesus crucified. He wasn't, well, he was of that leadership. And he was actually on his way to have Christians jailed and even killed. He stood there, thumbs up, while Stephen was killed for his faith in Jesus, because he did not believe. When he is on the Damascus road and this brilliant God of light appears to him, just like is appearing to near-death experiencers all around the globe today. Same one. And he asks, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. And I like to point out, you know, Jesus didn't tell him what to do. He didn't explain anything else. He later sends Ananias, a person, to explain all that Jesus had did. And Paul still had a free will. So Paul could have either decided to follow Jesus, but it was going to cost him a lot because he was a wealthy, powerful Pharisee. So he was about to lose his whole life, and he still had a choice. And I point that out because I think that's true with what near-death experiences are. That, you know, just because they encounter God, they still come back and they have a free will. They can either pursue, they can seek God, or they can just keep going their own way, or, you know, they still have a free will. I find many do seek, and when they do, they find. But, you know, and that's kind of what I'm pointing out as well. But I think it's the soul that leaves the body, but expands in powers. And Paul talks about this. That's where I was going. In Acts chapter 14, it says that a mob turned on Paul and he got stoned to death in Lystra. Stoned to death with rocks. Gotta always make that clear for people who don't know the Bible. That's how they killed people back then.
Right on.
So they stoned him. It says they stoned him to death, dragged him out of the city, and left him for dead. And then his friends gathered around him and are praying for him. And it says he gets back up and goes back into the city. So he's a badass, right? I mean, he's going back to the ones who just killed him. But Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, and I think he might be referring back, he says, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. I was taken up to paradise, and I saw and heard things inexpressible. Okay, so I wonder if that's when that happened. Right?
Interesting.
And then Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about how when our bodies are buried, they're buried in they're buried a natural body, but they're raised a spiritual body. He says they're buried in weakness, but they're raised in, the Greek word is dunamos, which means power. They're raised in new power. And that's exactly what near-death experiencers talk about, that they have this expanded experience. They have eyesight that's telescopic, like they can see thousands of miles zoomed as if right up close, every detail. Communication, they say, is pure. Some use the word telepathy, but it's more than that. It's thought to thought, but it's also feeling to feeling. It's perfect understanding. That is the communication on the other side. Travel, we're not limited like in this body. So it can be instantaneous in a thought. It can be kind of like on a people mover, almost like a floating or a flying. I've interviewed 2 different commercial airline pilots who clinically died. And I find it so fascinating that both of them, God gave them a fly-in over the holy city of God that John describes in the Bible in Revelation 21. And both these guys, one of them who was an agnostic when he died and cried out last minute. The other he was a believer, but, kind of just doing his own thing. Both of them get a fly-in over the city. And both of them said, I think God thought that'd be cool for me since I was a commercial airline pilot. I've done holding routes over every major city in the world.
Wow. Very interesting.
By the way, I interviewed a Hindu who'd never read the Bible before who described that exact same city.
No kidding.
To the T. But there are many like this. There's Pam Reynolds. She was a well-known singer, I think from Nashville, actually. And she had a deep brain aneurysm. And she was going to die unless they did this radical exploratory surgery, which is more common now. But what they have to do is they have to lower the body temperature down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They drain the brain completely of all blood. They have to make sure the brain is completely shut down because they're going to have to go down deep into the brain to fix the aneurysm. And so as a result, they're monitoring with an EEG. They tape the eyes shut so there are no external stimulation to the eyes. They put 100 decibel clickers in the ears so that then they can make sure there's nothing registering in the brain, just flat EEG. Okay, so this is all counts of clinical death are certain for the surgery to happen, and not many survive the surgery. So it only happens when there's no other option usually. So Pam is going into this surgery, and she's put into the deepest state of anesthesia for 2 hours. And Dr. Spetzler was her neurosurgeon who reported on this. Another a cardiologist that I interviewed, Dr. Sabum, also studied the case. There was a resident, Dr. Green, who has also testified because he was there when all this happened. So you've got medical doctors who are confirming what Pam ended up saying.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, and what people don't realize is like, these accounts have been written up in the Journal of the American Medical Association, in the Lancet, Europe's most prestigious medical journal, in psychiatry, in about 900 peer-reviewed scholarly journals that have reported on near-death experiences because there's something there, right? I mean, all these medical doctors wouldn't, they'd be like, yeah. And that's what many of them are at first, like, I never heard of that. But they didn't ask. And when they start asking, people start reporting. So Pam says she was out of her body and she's watching what's happening. And some of the things she later reports is that there was a female doctor down by her legs saying we can't find it. I can't find it. And the male doctor, Dr. Spetzler, said, try the other leg. And she registered that as strange because it was brain surgery. Like, what are they doing down by my legs? Well, they were trying to find an artery down there. And then it was about over an hour into surgery that they actually took out the saw. And, most people have never seen a brain saw. And, you think it's a saw, right? It's just going to cut. And she reported that when they took it out, it's called the Midas Rex. And she said it actually looked like an electric toothbrush. And they had like it almost looked like my dad's socket set, she said, with all these blades in it that they opened up. They didn't open that up until an hour into the deepest state of anesthesia and an hour into surgery, when she couldn't have seen anything. Her eyes are taped shut. There was no brain waves. So where is this memory being registered, right?
Wow.
Because she's got 100 decibel clickers in her ears, and they're monitoring that there's no activity in the EEG in her brain. Yet she perfectly reports about that. Then she claims she traveled, and this is another commonality of near-death experiences, through a tunnel to a place of exquisite beauty. She felt the presence, I think it was of her grandfather, and knew that God was there, this God of light and love, who told her she must go back. She comes back, and as she's coming back, they're sewing her up and they're playing Hotel California. And she hears that. And then they shocked her to get her heart started again, not once, but twice. And she reports that. So when she is revived, all these things that she reports checked out. Now, you could say, oh, that's just, that's a good story, right?
Who's she reporting this to?
To the doctors.
Is this right after surgery?
Yeah.
What are they saying?
Well, I was just in a movie called After Death, which was just in the theaters this fall. And you can see Dr. Green, who was a resident there, and he says she reported things she should not have seen. Dr. Spetzler, who was the neurosurgeon, he's done interviews. He said the same thing. Dr. Sabum, who was also in the movie, he researched it and said, yeah, I mean, she should not have been able to report that. Now, that's not a one-off. That's the thing. So another cardiologist that I spoke with, Dr. Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands, in Holland, he was the one who actually wrote the case up in the Lancet, Europe's medical journal, of a man who was found dead in a park, brought in, or he didn't have a heartbeat. They brought him into the ER. They were going to shock him, but they had to intubate him because he wasn't breathing. And the nurse found dentures. So took the dentures out, put him in the lower drawer of the crash cart. They intubated him. They shocked him. They got his heart started again. But he never came to in the ER. They wheel him out, put him in another room. A week later, he comes to. And he's asking, where are his dentures? You lost my dentures. And then he sees the nurse in the hallway and says, wait, that nurse, get that nurse. That nurse knows where my dentures are. And then he explains that he was in the ER up above trying to get everybody's attention. And he described the doctors, how many were there, who was there, the nurses, what they were wearing, and how that nurse had taken his dentures out and put it in the lower drawer of the cart with all the bottles on it. And that's where they found his dentures. Wow. So he writes this up in the Lancet. Now, Dr. Jan Holden actually did a study on verifiable observations of near-death experiencers. So she took close to 100 patients who had had cardiac arrest and claimed to have a near-death experience. And then, each one might make 10 or 15 observations of what was going on, right? And she went to hospital records, went and interviewed the people there to verify those observations. She found that 92% of their observations were completely accurate. Think about that. 92% were completely accurate. Another 6% were mostly accurate. Only 2%, which turned out to be one patient, were inaccurate.
Wow.
Compared to control groups of people who had had a cardiac arrest, and they asked them, what do you think happened during your resuscitation? And it was guesswork. It was like what they'd seen on ER. 20% accurate maybe.
Man,
Now, that's one of the 10 points of evidence that I write about in Imagine the God of Heaven that convinced me, but not just me, many of these skeptical medical doctors. Most of the ones I know are believers now because of what they've seen and heard studying these.
What do the I mean, when you're interviewing these doctors, let's say before they are believers, what do they have any? Is there any other explanations?
Well, yeah. So, Dr. Sabum, he was a Christian, and he actually set out. So he read the first research I did and said, "Bogus. I'm a cardiologist. I've never heard a patient say anything about, watching resuscitation or traveling this place of beauty or, this God of light or any of that." And so he set out to disprove it. But when he starts asking his patients, he starts to hear the same things. Now, there's an important reason for that. I mean, back to our analogy. If you experience something more real than this, more amazing, more beautiful, more, and it's kind of sacred to you. And when you try to explain it, people kind of look at you like, yeah, this is the drugs. Mm-hmm. And they just kind of or you're crazy. Mm-hmm. And so it shuts people down. So until more recently, people haven't been willing, not very willing to come forth. I'm amazed at the number of people when I speak on this will come up to me and say, that happened to me. And they'll tell me, and I'll ask, like if I'm speaking at a church, have you ever told your pastor? No, never have. Or, just have you ever told anyone? Well, I've told my wife, but that's it. So Dr. Sabum set out to disprove them, starts interviewing his patients, and hears more and more evidence like this. And, like this one guy, Pete, he said, when he was doing resuscitation on me, he had a heart attack and he was up above his body. He said, tell me what you saw. And Dr. Sabum said, if I had recorded what he said, I could have used that to teach physicians how to do resuscitation. He said he should not have been able to know that. And so he spent 5 years going through medical hospital records, trying to disprove scientifically near-death experiences. And instead, he's the one who wrote the article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, having changed his mind and saying, This is grounded in reality. Dr. Jeffrey Long was an oncologist who read that JAMA article, and he too, he said, oh, that can't be true. That's not right. Because most of these guys are coming from what's called a materialistic point of view, right? Worldview, which says that our brain is like the computer that runs the body. There's no soul. It's just what happens in your brain. It's just electrodes and, what happens across electrical synapses in your brain. But this has changed a lot of people's minds. And so Dr. Long also starts asking patients, starts hearing more and more, and then he sets up a whole research foundation, and he's now studied thousands. He's another like me who studied thousands of them. And he said that near-death experiences he came to this astounding conclusion that they are scientific proof of a life to come. Her name is Dr. Mary Neal. She's a spine surgeon. She was kayaking with her husband and a group of people in Peru, goes over a 15, 20 foot drop, which she said is not, it's not horrific for kayakers who know what they're doing, but she ended up at an angle where she plunged in, and the force of it pushed her down, and the nose of her kayak got lodged between two boulders under the waterfall. And so she's pinned to the front of her boat. She can't even release her spray skirt because the pounding of the waterfall. And, she did everything she could. She's a surgeon. So she's used to panic situations, and she tried to release herself and pretty soon realized she shouldn't be alive still. And it was interesting because she said, right before that, when she realized she can't free herself, she said, I said, God, your will be done, whatever it is. She just had this kind of surrendered posture to God, your will be done. And she said, what was interesting is I'd always feared a drowning death, like oxygen starvation. That terrified me. And she said, I never felt that. Instead, as soon as she called out to God, she felt Jesus physically holding her. She wasn't even a very strong believer. She'd gone through medical school and kind of wandered away and kind of become more of an agnostic materialist. And so the first time she told me, she was very hesitant. She's like, who am I that Jesus would care about me or be holding me? But she said, but I knew without a doubt. And she's very logical and analytical. And she said, I was fascinated because on the one hand, I'm having this conversation with him and she's having like this life review, which is another commonality of a near-death experience. She feels better than she's ever felt. This is more real than anything she's ever felt. But she's also aware that her knees are bending backward and breaking. So she realizes
Wow.
she's being like, her legs are, and she can somewhat feel it, but there's no pain in it. And then she feels this like kind of like a pop, and boom, she's out of her body, up out of the water, and she's watching her friends panic, swimming around, trying to find her in the waterfall. And then she sees this, what many of them call a welcoming committee of these people. But these people, she said, and by the way, that welcoming committee appears, on the other side, from what I understand, we can appear to each other just like we normally do. Like this one bank president, Marv Besteman, said, yeah, I was in my favorite golf outfit. And the people I saw were in kind of their native garb, whatever they would like. He saw, people from all countries. And, but sometimes they talk about these, they say they're like robes of white, but it's not robes of white. And it's interesting because that's found in Revelation, I think 3 and 5, somewhere like that, of, which I always thought, I don't want a robe of white, it doesn't sound good. But what I figured out is that they're actually translucent, and there is the light and love and life of God, which fills everything, coming out of them. So that's what Mary said she experienced, these people that she knew, and out of them was bursting this love that was light, welcoming her and greeting her. And she said it was the most joyous occasion. We hugged and we danced, and it was like this big party, this big celebration. And she said, because I knew these people, I had known them for as long as I existed. And then they began going down this path, this beautiful pathway, she said, lined with flowers. She loves flowers. And at the same time, though, she can see what's going on the riverbank. So she's having kind of almost this dual experience. And she ends up at this place, this large structure, and she can see in, and there are people in there, and it's a city. She says it's a city like bustling with life. There was life, there was activity. They were all busy doing something. But she said it was almost like there was this momentary, like stopping to acknowledge and just welcoming. She said, it was amazing. Who am I? I'm nobody. And yet I felt so accepted and so just welcomed in. And at another point, she had an encounter with Jesus, and I asked her, so what did he look like? Right? The question. And she said, this isn't going to make sense, but he looked like bottomless kindness and compassion. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, he had physical features, yes, but what just struck me is just bottomless kindness and compassion. Interestingly, a neurosurgeon, a neurologist that I interviewed, said something like that about standing there in the presence of God, that picture the kindest person you've ever pictured or known. You had to multiply it by thousands. And that's what he experienced, combined with the power of standing 5 feet away from a nuclear explosion. I mean, try to put all that in your head, you know, that's what blows your box open, right?
Yeah.
So Mary, interestingly, she asked Jesus, she said, man, this is so amazing. Like, why don't you give everybody this experience? Everybody would believe. And I love this because he quotes himself. What he said to Dr. Neal is what he said to Thomas, who's called Doubting Thomas. He's the disciple who, when Jesus was resurrected, wasn't there when Jesus first showed up to his followers. And they were telling Thomas, and he's like, I don't believe it. I'm not going to believe it until I stick my finger in the hole in his side. And Jesus shows up again, and he says, you know, hey, Thomas, touch me. See, I'm not a ghost. I'm physical. He eats fish with them. You know, they touch him. So he says, stick your hand in and see, I'm real. And then Jesus said to Thomas, blessed are you because you have seen, but even more blessed are those who have believed and yet not seen. And that's what he said to Mary. Just like, I love that. Jesus quoting himself.
Yeah. Wow.
So she comes back and, you know, I mean, it completely changed her. She was a materialist doctor, you know?
Is she the one who also was told that her son would die?
Yes. So when she came back, so she didn't want to come back. So this is another commonality of near-death experiencers. What they've told me is when you are in God's presence, you are with your best friend, the greatest dad you could ever imagine, and love that doesn't even compare to the most wonderful spouse or romantic lover, which sounds bizarre, but God's not a male or female. We're created in his image, not him and ours. I use him. The Bible uses him, but you know, it says male and female created in his image. So yeah, I mean, they don't want to come back. So she didn't want to come back, and she was fighting. This is another thing I love, Sean, is that people in God's presence are themselves. You know, their same sense of humor, their same, you know, whatever things about them they had. And many times they argue with him, and he gets it. He understands us. And you know, so she was very stubborn about it. Like, I am not going back. She had 2 little kids at the time, and she loved her kids, but that's how great it is. Mm-hmm. And that's common. And so he said to her, look, your son is not going to make it past age 18, or he's going to die at age 18 or something like that. And your family's going to need you to get through that. And then she came back. And at first, she tried to disprove her own near-death experience. She's like, that felt so real, but I want it to not be real because of what she was told was going to happen. And, but searching all the records of what happened to her and everything, and then hearing about others too, and she realized, no, it's real. And she didn't talk about it because, one, and she didn't write about it at first because how do you say to your kids, yeah, I didn't want to come back for you?
Yeah.
That's what she told me. I couldn't explain that to them. And then she had a time when her son was probably 16 or 17. And there was something they were talking about, when he's married and 30 or 40 and has kids of his own and all that. And he looked at her and he said something like, Mom, I'm not going to live that long. And she was like, it really struck her. But
Can you say that again? Her son said
her
that?
son kind of knew somehow that he wasn't going to live that long. And so then, sure enough, it was right after he was 18, and he was hit by a car and killed. And I'll tell you, an interesting thing, Sean, is Mary. Mary is a friend of mine, and she told me, and my wife Kathy, I know how wonderful it's going to be in the life to come. And I know how good God is, and I saw how his plan works together. It all works together, and it makes sense in the end, but it doesn't take away a mother's grief. It doesn't take away your grief for your friend you lost.
Yeah.
You still have to go through that. And it was hard for her.
I'll bet it was.
Colton Burpo would be an example of that. So he is a 4-year-old kid who basically they thought they lost him on the operating table. His dad is a pastor. So his dad goes into the closet in the hospital and he is screaming at God. He's so mad, and because he's it's true of all of us. We're like, wait, I served you and you're going to take my son? What is going on? And he was mad. He was angry. Colton, meanwhile, this 4-year-old, said that he was there with Jesus, and there were angels that were basically entertaining him while he was waiting, because Jesus said, you're going to have to go back. Your time isn't finished yet, which is a common thing that he'll say, is that you still have a purpose, or your time isn't done yet. And he sees his dad in that closet yelling at God, and he when he comes back, he told them that he saw him in there, and that Jesus told him, we need to pray for your dad right now. He's struggling. And so his son was praying for him in this struggle he's having with his own faith. And then Colton also, he said lots of things. One is he said, when he comes back, he said, Jesus had markers. And his dad was like, markers? What do you mean? You mean like markers like you write with? And he said, yes, he had markers right here and here. And then he realized, oh, he's got wounds. It's like if you put a marker dot.
Wow.
So there's a 4-year-old's trying to describe the wounds in Jesus' wrists that near-death experiencers commonly say.
That's a commonality.
I have a Rwandan imam. Well, I'll have to tell that one.
Okay.
But we'll come back to that one. But what Colton also said, so this 4-year-old comes back and he's talking to, and this is coming out over time, right? Because he's a 4-year-old. He doesn't know what he
doesn't even realize that this isn't
normal, or yeah. I mean, it all came out in the car when they're driving along and they drive by the hospital, and Colton says, that's where the angels sang to me. And it's a funny story. He said, and the father's like, what are you talking about? And he starts asking questions, and he said, yeah, the angels sang to me. When did the angels sing to you? When I was sitting on Jesus' lap. When were you sitting on Jesus' lap? That when you were yelling at God in that closet, he's like freaking out. Like, how did my 4-year-old son know I was in a closet yelling at God? Wow. So, and then along the way, Colton said, I met my sister. And they said, you don't have a sister. I said, yes, I met my sister. And she wanted me to tell you she's waiting for you. And then they realized they had had a miscarriage, but they had never told their 4-year-old son. And he told them it was a girl and she was waiting for them. Now, that's not uncommon either, where you have a sibling. There was another one in Finland, I believe, who this little girl dies, meets her sister, Reggie, on the other side, comes back and shares with her parents that she met Reggie, and they leave the room. They freak out because Reggie had died of accidental poisoning when she was like 2, before this little girl was ever born.
Wow.
How'd she know that? Karina Martinez, who died in COVID. This is all new to her. And her pacemaker fails. She's young, but she had to get a pacemaker because they misdiagnosed a heart issue. Anyway, she's floating up above her body. She sees her husband there. She's like, oh my gosh, am I dead? She grew up in Colombia, so in the Catholic Church, but horrific past. Her parents abandoned her, and she went down the road doing everything you could to just prove she was worth something. Just use your imagination. And she's realizing, oh my gosh, I'm dead. And she said, and God is real. She said she just had this instant realization, and she starts saying the Our Father that she had learned. But when she comes to Father, forgive me, she was like, I meant it. I was like, I realized. And she just started saying, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. But she was headed to hell. And she knew it. And then an arm grabs her and turns her around and brings her up. And she's going up into this light. And she sees all these people. And she hears this voice that she knows is the voice of God. And it said, come, you're home, come. And she said, no, I can't. I'm filthy. I'm horrible. I deserve hell. Send me back there. That's what I deserve. And this is common too, is that in God's presence, it's like the truth is the truth. It's like we can hide and pretend and rationalize and justify and all that, but there you don't. And so they commonly say, God was not judging me. I was judging myself. Which is interesting because Jesus once said, by your own words will you be acquitted. By your own words will you be condemned. And Jesus said, I didn't come into the world to condemn the world. I came into the world that through me, the world might be saved or rescued. And so she cries out anyway. She's going up into this light. She sees all these people and they're like celebrating her. And she's like, me? Why are they celebrating me? And she said, I'm filthy. I deserve that. And he says, no, you're worthy. Come. I love you. And she still is. See, and this is the thing that's amazing, Sean. We're ourselves. We don't just boom change instantly from ourselves when we cross over. That's why how we live our lives today matters, because we're becoming something that continues on. And so here's Jesus trying to encourage her. She's worthy. And what she later realized is that she just asked his forgiveness, and that's all it took. That's all it takes. It's just wanting him, wanting his forgiveness, wanting his love, wanting his guidance. That's all it takes. You don't have to be perfect. Anything can be forgiven. Anything. And she was still hesitant. She said, God, if it really is okay, if it really is safe, show me someone who's gone before me that I love. And he said, look to your right. So she looks to her right, and there is her dog that died the week before, and her other dog that had died like 3 years earlier. And then she knew, and in she goes and has this amazing experience amazing. I don't even go into more of it, but just the beauty and the joy and the excitement of it all. And she was like, let me go back. I want to tell everybody. And that's what she's been doing since 2020. I got to kind of calm her down a little bit because she's a little over the top. Sometimes she's so enthusiastic, you know?
Why don't you want to go deeper into what you saw? Or do you want to do that later?
We can later. But what I was going to point out is that the people that welcome us sometimes are our relatives, sometimes are our friends, but in her case, it was her pets. So Vicky, she died in a car accident. She was about 22, I think. And then they resuscitated her. Then the hospital, they're operating on her, and she codes again. And she's up above her body, and they say different things. Fascinating, because they're trying to adjust to this new sense. And they start to realize, oh, this must be sight. But it's a different kind of sight, because it's a different order of magnitude of sight as well. And so Vicky realizes from her wedding ring that it had an orange blossom on it, you know, that she had felt that this, and her long hair, this must be her. Like, I must be dead. But she felt great. And it was chaos. And she was like, I'm out of here. Like, she knew Jesus. She knew where she was going. She's like, I'm out of here. I don't want to be here. I know where I'm going. And she takes off, and she said through this, she called it a tube or a tunnel. And what was colorful, all of a sudden there was, she called no color, black, but that's the way she described it. And she comes out in the end of this tube and is kind of like deposited in this garden-like setting, grass and flowers and trees and just immaculate beauty. But as they commonly say, but with colors we don't even have here on earth, and a vividness we don't even have here on earth. But the way Vicky and other blind people describe it is they say things like, it was different shades of brightness. So, I mean, how would you describe color?
Yeah.
You know, if you don't really know it, but they would describe it like that. But what's fascinating is, so then she has this welcoming committee of people coming toward her, her grandmother, Debbie and Darlene, who died. She grew up in a home for the blind, and they died at age 9 and 7 of other complications. And she said that I recognized them, but they were in their prime. And this is a fascinating thing, is people often say, sometimes they'll see like a grandparent as they remember them best, like they're older. But sometimes, and most of the time, people are about, they say, in their 30s. Late 20s, 30s. So she says they're in their prime. And, but here's the fascinating thing. So Vicky, and then Brad Burroughs, who was a 8-year-old kid, also blind from birth when he died. He also sees his roommate, hearing him choking, and his roommate stumbling out, later reported that. He too goes up above the home that they lived in, saw the snow and the plow, you know, and he'd never seen his playground and then he goes up and he's in this meadow, he says this giant meadow of like, beautiful tall grass. He saw palm trees and he said, but everything was soaking in this light. It was like this light just soaking in everything. And the light was palpable. You could feel the light, and the light conveyed love. Now, Vicky said almost the same thing. So she said this light was coming out of the birds, out of the trees, out of the flowers, and even out of the people, but the light was life and the light was love all together. Okay, so hang on to that thought for a second. Blind people would not hear that light comes out of everything. They would have heard on earth that light shines on things, right? So how do you have consistently blind people reporting that the light of heaven comes out of everything? And that's what sighted near-death experiencers say as well. Now, interestingly, back to the prophet Isaiah chapter 60, God tells the prophet Isaiah, there is no sun or moon in heaven because God is its light. Revelation chapter 21, John, one of Jesus' disciples, said he was taken up in a vision of heaven, saw heaven. And he said the city of God, which he describes, he said he was up on a very high mountain, and he then describes this city of God. And he said, but there was no sun or moon, for the glory of God is its light, and the Lamb, referring to Jesus, is its lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. This is Revelation 21.
Wow.
Now, how do you make this up to get people who are blind from birth claiming they did die, and then claiming they're talking about the light of heaven operating the way a prophet from 780 BC and one of Jesus' disciples in about 90 AD write the same thing? This one guy in Rwanda, fascinating story. His mother was a Hutu and his father was a Tutsi. So if you know anything about the Rwandan genocide, those were the two that killed each other. And his father was a sheikh and an imam in the Muslim religion. Mom was a prophetess of the native goddess Beko. And it's a long story, fascinating story. In the Rwandan genocide, his family got torn apart. His father gets put in prison, blames his mom, divorces his mom. At age 8, he gets put out on the street, pretty much begging for food, ends up doing drugs and then dealing drugs to make money. And just, had been through, a lot of trauma, a lot of stuff. And then he ends up getting blood cancer. And he's dying of this blood cancer. They put him on palliative care. His father had tried to get the Muslims to, do their rituals and pray for him, and they put the Quran on his head and all this, and nothing worked. His mom went to, her goddess and tried all that. That didn't work. Her son's dying. She goes to the Anglican church because she had seen someone healed in the name of Jesus. And she was desperate. So she said, will you pray for my son in the name of Jesus? And she was too, and they were fasting and praying for a week. Meanwhile, her son dies. So Swadik is his name. He dies, and he finds himself in this hellish place. Hellish near-death experiences are not uncommon, by the way. Of people reporting near-death experiences, 23% report hellish experiences.
Wow.
So I do a whole chapter in Imagine Heaven, kind of trying to make sense of all that, because you can't take the good and leave the bad. You got to make sense of both, right? So he starts off having this hellish experience in this room that he called like a slaughterhouse. And these 3 creatures, is all I can call them, attacking him. And when he said, into the room comes this man of light in a robe with a gold sash and light just coming out of him, shooting into Swadik's eyes, he said, and just going through my whole soul. And he held out his arms like this, and Swadik saw the holes in his hands. And then he knew who it was, because Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ had come to Rwanda, and he had seen it accidentally. And so Jesus says to him, I died for mankind. You're among those I died for. Never deny it and tell it to everyone. He wakes up, sits up with a cloth over his face, and all these people just start screaming. And he looks down to his right, and there's a grave. And he didn't know what's going on. So it had been overnight, and they were at his burial. And he sits up, and he starts saying, Jesus is here. Jesus saved me. Jesus is the one who brought me back. And all these Muslims are going, they're just freaking out. About half of them did come to faith in Jesus that day because they saw it. Today, he is an Anglican pastor who has had 7 attempts on his life, including his father trying to poison him. Because you can't convert in an Islamic country.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to Swadik. I mean, he's a courageous young guy, and he's like, I asked him, are you afraid? And he's like, why would I be afraid? He brought me back from death, and he told me tell everybody, so he won't shut up. So it's actually the most life-altering, apart from being in the presence of God. Near-death experiencers say the life review was the most life-altering thing they'd ever experienced. It changes them. So commonly after experiencing this God of light, who is love, who's personal, who gets them, they can be themselves, He will sometimes just tell them, sometimes ask them, do you want to review your life? Sometimes he's like, I want you to see something. So it's different. And what happens, again, because time doesn't work the same way, they can re-experience their whole life, and it doesn't matter how long they were clinically dead on earth. And they say, it's like they re-experienced it all at once, but I'm telling it to you in order.
Like legitimately re-experience their entire life.
Re-experience it.
Not certain portions.
No.
Like from birth to death.
Yes. And they say, now again, and I think in part this is because we're all unique, and God knows our uniquenesses. So there's some uniquenesses to each one. So some of them, they said, God just showed me certain things that he wanted me to see. So it wasn't all of it. But most of them, I find, it is all of it. Like if they're 18, it's up till they're 18. If they're 50, it's all the way up till they're 50. And they're watching their life replay as if almost like a hologram, but they're there. And they're re-experiencing it. One really trippy one, this CEO, he was a pharmaceutical executive and then a CEO of several biomedical companies. Again, these guys are like, they got a lot to lose. In fact, when he first read my book, Imagine Heaven, and he came to me and he was nervous about talking publicly about it because he was like, my career will be gone. Mm-hmm. And yet they do, but he is there with Jesus. He had 6 embolisms travel up his leg and had a pulmonary embolism, blocked his breathing. Then his body goes into sepsis, shuts down. And he finds himself in, again, this incredibly beautiful place. And he's with Jesus. He's walking with him. And then Jesus starts to show him these vignettes of his life. Okay. And there's like a life review. Now, in his case, it wasn't everything. But he showed him these different points. And this one was, first he had a really hard upbringing. So he had no friends. He was in and out of the hospital a lot. He was overweight, so he was bullied a lot. And Jesus is showing him this. And he's like, why are you showing me this? Like, I mean, he's basically like, this sucks. Why are you making me relive this? Because they not only see it, you feel it, you think it, you remember everything as if you were re-experiencing it, but not just what you were thinking and feeling, what the other people you were interacting with were also thinking and feeling. So it's like you experience your life in a relational way from God's perspective. That's what's so life-altering about it. But what was kind of cool in Randy's case is he asked, why are you showing me this? And then it dawned on him. Were you there with me? And Jesus looks at me and he says, I was always with you, just waiting for you to turn to me. And he was basically showing him that, even in all the suffering, he's been there through it. He's been there with him. And he goes to another venue where he sees himself now, and he became an atheist. He went to Northwestern University. He tried to disprove God and disprove all religions. And he went through this whole, he was a pretty mean atheist for a while. And so he's working as an orderly in a hospital, and he goes to serve food to this little 7-year-old boy dying of cancer. So this is Randy standing with Jesus in this heavenly experience, watching and experiencing this scene play out again. And the little boy, he comes in, the little boy said, "I'm dying, but I'm going to go to heaven." And Randy said, "Well, I'm really sorry, but if there is a heaven, I'm sure you will go there." And the little boy said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And he said, "No, I don't really believe in all that, but I'm glad you do. I'm sure you'll be there." And the little boy, this little 7-year-old dying of cancer, right? And he says to him, "I'm going to pray for you, and you'll be there too." And Randy's standing there with Jesus in heaven, watching this little boy pray for him, who he didn't even know. And he realizes that God used even that in all the things of his life to get him there.
Wow.
And so the reliving these life reviews, what people commonly say to me is that it was their whole life. And like Dr. Mary Neal said, it was like my life was laid bare for all its good and all its bad. And so they're seeing this again. Now, here's the thing, Sean, is most people fear that. I have. There are things in my life I don't want to sit there and watch before God, right? And then I started to realize, okay, wait a second. This is God. Do I really think I've been hiding? Mm-hmm. Do I really think he doesn't know everything? And that's the reality. No, he's been with you always. And when you start to realize the character of God, that God cares about us, like you care for your little son, like I care for my daughter and son, my little granddaughters, more so. Infinitesimally more so. And he has compassion and mercy, and he wants to help us. He's not a condemning. That's what Jesus said. I didn't come to condemn. I came to rescue. And so that's what near-death experiencers commonly say. They say, God was not judging me. I was judging myself. God was unconditionally loving me and supporting me through this, learning about my life. The comeback is the bad part.
Okay.
They're often depressed coming back. They don't want to come back. It's hard coming back. One guy told me it's like being put back into the sewer when you've experienced paradise,